what the big issues are and what the various political parties stand for. So we've just finished some initial research looking at how the SABC has been covering the elections, and there are a few things that really stand out. The one is that SABC far exceeds all of the other media that we've been monitoring in terms of party coverage issues when it comes to diversity. In other words, SABC is accessing more parties than all of the other media that we're busy monitoring.
So we're really encapsulating or giving a platform to a diversity of voices.
A far greater diversity. Look, I know some parties, the moment they hear this, they're going to go, oh, but you're not giving us, and they're going to go bananas about that, yes. Which, you know, it's this notion of equitable coverage, which is a problematic thing. But the key answer is, the reason it's so important is that people need to be able to go into the voting booth on Wednesday and with some idea, if they wanted to,
of
knowing who to...
We want them well informed
exactly.
to make the best decision possible for themselves.
Exactly.
William, I want you to fill us in, because you've been at this game for about 25 years now. What have you been doing when it comes to monitoring how media reports on elections in the lead up and during the elections and post-elections as well?
So we're currently monitoring about 120 different media. And there what we do, so ICASA regulates the broadcaster as they are you now, for example, and if SABC decides not to broadcast a party election advert or something like that, ICASA will step in and get involved. But what we do that's pretty unique is that we look and we analyze the content of the coverage. Is it in the public interest? Does it serve the public's agenda as opposed to political parties? And what are the issues that are there? Because we know that some of the big issues don't tend to get covered. So we monitor the media to see how they cover the issues, which way they cover them. We look at how issues like gender-based violence are reported, and then also look at who has the greatest share of voice.
Yes. Just on that note, to what extent are broadcasters right now in the country meeting the needs of the public?
Well, I guess
I know it's a multifaceted question,
there,
but if you can put it in a nutshell for us.
Is this issue of equitable coverage and fair coverage. And the good news there is that, and this is something that our media very seldom gets any kind of credit for, is that overwhelmingly across all of our democratic elections, there have literally been a handful of different media entities that have not covered the elections fairly. So the majority of coverage at the moment, I think we found that 98% of the SABC's coverage is clearly fair. In other words, there's no evidence where you interview one party and then you didn't get a response or a reply from them.
How do you assess what is fair and what is not fair, William? What mechanisms are you using to do that? So
fairness we make up on a basis of 3 or 4 different criteria. So the first is, and I think it's 3 actually, forgive my Sunday brain. But the first is you look at the party voices across that, right? So are they giving roughly equitable coverage to the various diverse political parties? If, for example, you've got one media or one entity, as we found in 2016, where one particular channel on SABC, for example, was clearly giving excessive amounts of coverage to one party, the ruling party, and then clearly at the time disfavoring the DA and the EFF at the time, right? That's when you can see that something was looking not right, because if you look on balance across all of the different media, you'll find that they tend to cover the parties with different regional focuses, but you get equitable coverage. So that's the first point. Then you look at, in the language and in the way that the piece is constructed, is there any evidence that it is clearly favouring or clearly disfavouring any particular party or entity? So some examples of that is if you go and you report only on what the EFF says about all of the other parties, and then you don't give them a right of reply, that could, if you do that consistently, suggest that there's a pattern of bias. But what you find that the majority of our media do is, if one of the parties says, this party's rubbish and they should all be in jail, and the other one says, then you'll go to those parties and they'll say, no, they say that because they're the ones who should be in jail, right? So you tend to find that our parties do cover each other, our media cover each other, cover the parties equitably.
In your 2016 report that you mentioned just now, you said the ANC received 43.5%, followed by the DA with 24%, the EFF came in at 12%, the NFP with 4.7%, and the IFP at 4.3%, and this left the other smaller political parties with just 11%. Right now, William, who gets the lion's share of the coverage, because we, like you've mentioned, we often have smaller parties accusing the media, getting very emotional about these issues, saying that we are favouring or larger parties like the African National Congress. But is that true factually?
So, no is the short answer to that question. Right. Certainly in the case of the public broadcaster, I think that we've seen a significant positive shift in the commitment of the SABC, various channels and broadcasting entities to make sure that they cover the elections in a fair and independent manner. I think that it's possibly one of our best election news stories so far is the way that the SABC sought to cover the different parties. Because if you look at the spread there, the party that's getting the lion's share is, surprise, the ANC. But that's
based on representation.
Exactly.
It's how
it's
it should
broadly
be.
as it should be. What is interesting is that when you look at the SABC services against, say, some of the other media, you'll find that those parties, the top three parties, so you talk about the ANC, the DA and the EFF, they get slightly less coverage on the SABC services because the SABC is then giving more of that coverage to more of the other smaller parties, which is why I think the majority of coverage on the SABC, about 70% of it goes to the top three in total, and then the other remaining amounts get divided up between the smallest, whereas if you look at the other media, it tends to be around 80% goes to the top three parties. In other words, you're getting less voices from fewer political parties on those entities.
All right, let's just be straight. There's over 40 political parties right now on the ballot, right? No media in the world, even with the best will be able to ensure equitable coverage.
Yep.
I mean, there are some parties who are dodgy, there are some fledgling parties, some fly-by-nights. So it just seems like it's such a fine, difficult balancing act at this point. And then it really comes down to a judgment call by the editors in charge. And they, of course, have to factor things in, like how many hits a website will get or how many newspapers will sell that week.
So in the case of the SABC, and they really are leading the way in this regard, you know, they've got a fairly well-defined policy around how you understand equitable coverage. And principles that go into that are around fairness. They do take, of course, into account newsworthiness and the nature of the event that they are being asked to cover. And then they look at representation, they look at what polls are saying, they look at how old the party is, does it have any kind of a track record. And so across all of those factors, they're then able to determine what and which issues should be getting coverage. But of course, you can't cover all 48 parties. So is this the best system? You know, in all honesty, I don't think that it is. But is there something better than that? If there is, I'd love to know what it is, because I don't know any democracy around the world that's got a system that ensures that all of those parties can get it. And yet, the irony is, of course, is one of those 48 may well have better policies, more, you know, they might have more fresh ideas, really effective things, and most of us aren't going to know about them because of the nature of that thing. So it is and it isn't a good system, but that's when you look within that system and you say, is our public broadcaster especially adhering to that? The simple answer is yes, they are.
Yes, they are. Look, so media coverage, you're telling me, is broadly based on parliamentary representation, but there is one party that keeps bucking the trend here, and that's the EFF. And they have become media strategists of note, haven't they? I mean, we have reporters from all across the country flocking to press conferences, whether they really know what's going to be announced at that press conference or not.
Yep. I mean, they are masters of media strategy, and they know that if they go there, they're going to get something juicy. So if you look, I think at the, a few months ago now, when the EFF called the press conference, they didn't have to say, this is what we're going to discuss. They just said, we're having a press conference, and they knew everyone would just show up because you're going to get some great one-liners, you're going to get some controversy, you're going to get some provocation, you know, all sorts of things. So they really are very good at doing that. So they don't need to then spend a lot of their time trying to communicate those things. And you compare that, say, with the DA, where, you know, they have a very, very effective communications thing where they just churn out, you know, press releases and communication 24/7. I mean, quite how they do it, I'm not quite sure. And yet they don't get that same level of uptake on a lot of those press releases that they issue, primarily because I think that, you know, they're not Julius Malema. The man has to be one of the most incredible politicians in terms of knowing how exactly to manipulate the media's agenda. So yes, they do get, and certainly in the past they have got significantly higher level of media coverage across different entities than they probably or possibly may have warranted. But you know, that's the nature of it. It requires media to be more discerning, I guess, about what they are going to cover. But then, of course, they think if we didn't carry that one-liner that is just used now
somebody
at
else
Orlando
is.
Stadium, someone else is, and then they're going to get all the traffic.
Look, you've actually preempted my next question, William. What determines the news agenda in the country right now, in your own experience? Because it just doesn't mean because a politician says something somewhere we should all be flocking there, like you said just now.
So politicians, and this is the irony, right? News, almost by definition, is what's news. It's something that's new or different. It bucks the trend. It disrupts what's going on. It disrupts the normal, as they say in cultural studies. And yet we tend to then give politicians almost carte blanche. Most of the time, politicians, we know what they're going to say before they even go there.
Yes.
At a rally, you know that Party A is going to say, vote for us, we're the best, we're going to solve everything, blah, 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 the others all rubbish, right? How that even constitutes news, I'm not sure. So I think that far too often we allow politicians to determine our media agenda and we don't sufficiently push the issues that we need to be getting them to answer. In other words, if you look at our media analyses over the last set of elections, you'll find that far too often our media are just following whatever the political parties and the route that they're guiding them down, instead of them saying, these are the big issues. Unemployment. So, for example, where's the issue of land? Just prior to, towards the end of the year, land, massive issue. And yet suddenly, you have to hunt really high and low to find stories that deal with what the various political parties are saying and doing about land. Or on bigger issues, gender-based violence, for example. Like where are those things? Which isn't to say that there aren't stories about them. And when you find them, they tend to be really good. But far too often we allow our agenda to be determined not by media saying this is what our public and the voters need to know, and this is what we're going to be finding out for them.
And often political party leaders or politicians themselves will accuse the media fraternity of bias, or even collective bias at that, for or against whichever party it is. But they really are not innocent players in all this, are they? In many instances, they are the drivers of the media agenda.
Yeah, completely. And I think, this disillusionment that people have with politicians and with where things are going, in as much as we can say media should be helping unpack where the different parties stand on land, for example, or on combating gender-based violence, or how we're going to meet the needs of our children. A lot of that is determined by the fact that political parties don't do this. I was doing training just last week with one of the senior observer missions for South Africa, and I asked them who had read any of the political party manifestos. There were 2 people in a room out of 40 that had read them. That says there's not only an issue with the way media cover these things, but that fundamentally political parties are failing to drive that thing, and that they've bought in completely to this idea of elections are about the leader figure. So we think it's about Mr. Malema or Mr. Ramaphosa. It isn't. This is about the party. It's about the policies. It's about who's going to be in parliament. Because make no error, those people aren't there for most of the hard work that needs to get done, which is where Parliament comes in, and that's where their policy approaches are so fundamental. So it's nice and it looks sexy and it gets all the headlines now, but actually democracy doesn't work there with those people. They need to be there, and I'm not denying their importance, but the real work comes up with other areas.
William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa, thank you for sharing your invaluable insights with us on the SABC News Desk. Well, earlier, IFP leader Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi addressed supporters at the party's final rally in Ulundi, KwaZulu-Natal. The rally was set to be live on the SABC News channel, but due to some delays in other political rallies, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi's speech had to be recorded. Let's listen in.
I'm introducing a leader of high caliber who does not tolerate corruption. We welcome our president to speak to us today here at Ulundi, Dabezita Shen.
Sacela labo comrade abalapha phesheya bathula umsindo. O comrade labo balapha phesheya